welcome back to Bandwagon Fans. This is Jeff.
Renee.
Scott.
And we are going to be doing a discussion today about how to separate the art from the artist and what kind of where our responsibilities or our feelings are as an audience member when the people involved in a film are, to say the least, problematic. And this comes from last week. Renee and I went to go see Anna. And knowing absolutely nothing about the movie until the very end, we saw that it was written and directed by Luc Besson.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next day, realized that Luc Besson has a whole bunch of allegations against him, up to and including rape, which probably would have changed whether or not we would have gone to see that movie at all.
Yeah.
But in the era of Me Too, there is no shortage of these stories, so we're going to kind of go through, talk about some of them, but. So that's kind of the impetus for this discussion. But real quick, without knowing any of this stuff, without the connection to Luc Besson, what did you think of the movie itself?
It was like a paltry version of Red Sparrow. It was like a cheap, poor man's Red Sparrow.
Right.
Yeah, it was not a strong film.
It was not good. There were a couple scenes in the movie that, particularly towards the beginning, there was a scene where it was a close-up on Anna, the main character's face, and it looked like she was being raped.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it was presumably, within the context of the movie, consensual. She was with her boyfriend, but clearly she did not want to be involved there.
Mm-hmm.
Was that uncomfortable for you watching that? It was for me.
It was, but also I couldn't tell it was her. Like there was also this jump. I'm like, who's this woman? Like what's going on? And then I was like, oh, that's her. You know, it was a side part of it was a side angle, and the character was dressed. So it took me a while to put together the fact that it was the same. I almost leaned over and said, is that her?
Yeah.
But no, that was not fun. And they were also trying to use it as a mechanism to talk about why her character was really upset and should have been, and was seeking to get out of her situation. But it just wasn't very effective for that.
Right.
Yeah.
And knowing what Luc Besson, what he's been accused of afterwards,
mm-hmm.
would that cause you to reinterpret that particular scene or any scene in Luc Besson's filmography?
I don't know. I mean, I think that's where we start getting a little tricky with this type
mm-hmm.
of stuff is how much each scene can be traced back to a specific element of a narrator, I'm sorry, that was a writer stuff, but traced back to a director's life, like what those connections are. And I would say maybe, but I also know that there's a lot of creative license that happens. And so maybe the sort of spirit of it is being used, but not maybe the actual logistical sort of setup of certain things.
Yeah. And I kind of dove right into this kind of topic, but it goes right to the heart of the matter of the question of how do we separate the art from the artist?
Right.
One of the things you had said,
we should, right?
So one of the things you had said a couple weeks ago, last week or 2 weeks ago, was you had mentioned that you're going to start putting your money where your values are.
Right.
You're going to start supporting the things where you believe in the cause, even if the movie itself might not be very good.
Right.
If it's a cause you believe in, you're going to put your money there.
Yeah.
Conversely, would that mean that you're going to withhold your money from movies that betray your values?
100%, yeah.
So then, which would lend to the idea of you're not going to separate the art from the artist.
No.
Okay.
That is not my intent. Yeah.
All right.
I think that is in all forms. And I think the idea that we have to think about too is like historical sort of context, like when certain art, so paintings, music, all those sort of things, sort of how they play into the historical development of that in that field or that form. I think there's something to be said for acknowledging that certain songs, certain films, certain paintings are really integral to the movement. Mm-hmm. But that's not the same thing as me going out there and saying, I'm going to actively seek these pieces out and participate in them, because I think I will absolutely not do that. I will do the opposite. I will actively work to avoid those and seek out other better options.
Okay. I'm going to kick this same question. Now, you did not see Anna. Lucky you.
I didn't.
However, we have...
Thanks for not inviting me.
You're welcome.
I think we did invite you.
You were very high on Bohemian Rhapsody.
I did like Bohemian.
Now, at the time, you weren't really aware that it was directed by Bryan Singer or Bryan Singer's background.
I didn't know the background.
Right, and the allegations of him molesting teenage men. knowing that, would that change whether or not you would have even gone to see Bohemian Rhapsody?
That's a challenging question on a number of levels. I think sometimes we go to see movies because we want to be critical of them, and I don't mean critical in like we don't want to be down on them, but we actually go because we want to have something to say about them, which may be, and I don't mean like an arrogance in this, but may mean that we may go see movies for different reasons than other people do. So yes, I would still go see it, and understanding that even in going to see it, I would probably pay to go see it, and then that would put some shekels in the pocket ultimately of the people who produced it. So,
or drive the movie to getting a Best Picture nomination.
That could.
Which
But whether or not I would recommend it to somebody else to go see based on that knowledge would be a really complicated question. And I think rather than recommending it or not recommending it, it would probably drive a conversation versus me trying to decide for somebody else what they should decide to do about that.
So almost like putting a preface before it, like an informed, like giving them information to make an informed choice about whether or not they'll see the film.
Yeah, I mean, let's take allegations against Woody Allen. Like, should you go see Annie Hall like I saw when I was in film school? You probably should see Annie Hall if you're going to do critique of film, because Annie Hall changed the way that films were made. So there's some reason and some rationale for seeing Annie Hall. If you have the ability to go someplace, you're looking for a movie for entertainment value sheerly, you're not looking at sort of the historical place that it sets in, then maybe you shouldn't go see Annie Hall if that is something that you're ethically opposed to, or morally opposed to, or some combination of ethically and morally opposed to. So I don't think it's a straight up no-go zone.
No, and that's a little bit of what I was talking about earlier about this idea that there are some things that are inextricably woven into the history of the form, and so it is difficult to pull that out and tease that out and say that it should be a no-go. But like that's very different than me as a consumer putting my money towards it, right? So I will absolutely refuse to support Woody Allen. I'm not going to go see any of Woody Allen's films,
Right.
So we're gonna put a pin in the educational aspect.
Okay.
Because there's a couple movies that definitely are influential in the history of film, but kind of become problematic as time goes on.
I can think of several.
Yeah. But I want to go back to the question about the movie Anna. And kind of challenge, and I nominally agree with you that if I had known ahead of time, I would have been like, all right, we're gonna go see Toy Story instead, right? But I want to bring up a counterpoint, and that is this movie, and this was the debut or the big breakout for Sasha Luce. She's the woman that played Anna,
correct? Yeah.
A Russian model, and this movie tanked her acting career is probably over now because this movie is going to tank or is tanking. So is it fair for the women who are innocent, and not just women, but all the people involved in this film, is it fair for them to be punished because of the actions of Luc Besson?
I mean,
and isn't that what we're in fact doing by saying we're not going to go see this movie because of this person?
Honestly, until those types of films tank and they realize that a man's genius is not a reason to continue doing those sort of things, I think that's a problem. So there's going to be some collateral damage, and I think movies, we were talking about before we started filming, movies are more epic in that sense because so many people are participating. But those studios, if those films stop making money, those studios can no longer ignore the fact they can't hire problematic men.
Yeah, okay, and a couple things come to mind. Problematic people, even, right? So
true, not just men. Yeah.
A couple things come to mind. One, life's not fair, So there are other movies that don't get shown or tanked for a variety of reasons that aren't the fault of a brilliant actor or actress who is being showcased in them. And there are some brilliant actors and actresses who are showcased in amazing movies and for some reason just never get picked up again. And so there's no guarantee for anybody in Hollywood that that this vehicle is going to be the thing that takes you. So I don't really consider that to be a punishment per se. But I also think that what you said is so important regarding this. I've thought about this a lot. This is a singular art form in that it requires so many people.
Yep.
Yes.
And if you look at the credits at the end of any movie now, you're seeing literally thousands and thousands of people.
Yeah.
And then the question is the singular vision of a I want to say bad actor, but I don't mean actor, somebody who's a problematic person, is that singular vision something that really ought to tank the entire ship? And maybe that answer is yes, if they're the captain. I'm not saying that that's not the case, but it makes you wonder about the producers.
Right.
What if the producers don't know? What if this is something that comes up? Clearly the people producing the Kevin Spacey series on Netflix I'm sure they were taken aback and thought, what are we supposed to do? And maybe have
I would not make that assumption.
Okay.
So one of the things that's come out with Me Too Movement in Hollywood is how many look back at Harvey Weinstein. It was open knowledge.
Known.
True.
Yeah.
I probably misspoke about that.
Seth Rogen even made a joke about Harvey Weinstein during one of the Oscar ceremonies. So,
and the lead singer of Courtney Love, she was blacklisted because very early on she came out and said, this guy's not right. Blacklisted.
Right.
But it was a known thing. It was not.
And Kevin Spacey, there had been rumors about Kevin Spacey. I might be overstepping my knowledge on him specifically, but I don't think it was. In most of these instances, I don't think it was too much of a surprise.
That's the bullshit part.
He was a bad example.
Well, no, but I'm just saying that predators no one's getting away with it. Predators are, especially at that level, people know. People are funneling, people are supporting those behaviors.
Right.
Just like in the churches and just like all those places, people are condoning it by turning blind eyes. And so later on they get to be like, did you know? Wink. I mean, they did, right? Like many of them. Not. I'm not talking about specific people. I don't have anyone specific in mind, but they know that these people are causing problems.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about where we draw the line. So you mentioned the captain of the ship. If it's the captain of the ship, then you're more inclined to say, I'm not watching that movie.
Sure. Yeah.
The Predator. Now, that's a movie that none of us actually saw.
Right.
And you probably couldn't be dragged to it in a million years.
Please no.
I would see that one on Netflix, right? Like,
So The Predator kind of got put in the news because Shane Black hired a supporting actor by the name of Steve Wilder, who had previously been convicted of, I believe, sexual assault. And didn't tell anybody else in the cast about it, and Olivia Munn in particular was quite upset about this. So with those bare facts, if you had known about all this prior to the movie coming out, would that set of facts stop you from going to see this movie? It's a supporting actor who's in a movie for a couple minutes.
Right.
And again,
the idea that the buck stops here, there is responsibility at management level. Yeah. Even sometimes for things that, if you run a company, if you have a business, you are responsible for things that happen. In this case, it sounds like the director knew, but even
the director absolutely knew.
But even sometimes if you don't know, you do shoulder some responsibility.
Sure.
For that. It may not be always legal responsibility, certainly some ethical responsibilities who maybe have dug a little bit deeper.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So I guess, but to your question is knowing that, am I going to go see Predator? That's difficult. I'm trying to think of if there was an equivalent of a movie that I really wanted to see and then found out that one of the characters, right? Like, because I'm like, yeah, maybe not. But I don't know. That is a little bit harder, sort of like where someone is on the pay scale in some ways, right? Like if we found out the janitor, right? Like, or some, like where does that sort of like end? And I don't know that I have a definitive. Maybe that's definitely a case by case.
What about in this case too? Jeff was mentioning before we started filming that his understanding is, let's say you really wanted to see The Predator.
Yeah, like I was
it's just your thing.
It is kind of.
They
but-
edited that out.
Yeah.
Whether under pressure or not under pressure. But then do you maybe go out of your way to support it even a little more because they maybe didn't do the right thing at first, but they did the right thing later down the line? Or do you say, no, they were doing the wrong thing from the beginning, I don't want to? I mean,
Right.
it really is
It's
complicated.
It is. And I would say that I don't know that I'd go out of my way, but I might do one of those things where you're like, it's not so bad, you know, and then you go because
Right.
you really want to see that movie, knowing that,
Right.
you know, it was something like, what if I do want to see Toy Story a lot, right? Like, or Star Wars. Like, if I found out if Star Wars, there was something that happened on the Star Wars set, I would feel a true conflict. It would be very difficult. I'd have to
Sure.
wrestle, you know, a bit
Right.
to find out how that would look.
And
Yeah.
if the second assistant to the head prop buyer,
Right.
do you not go see that movie?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think we can. The consensus would be that there is a point where the further up the food chain you go, the more likely you are to boycott that movie.
Yeah.
So, taking that logic to the other extreme, we've been talking about directors and down. How about production companies and Harvey Weinstein and all Miramax movies?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like, how far do we as consumers delve to find out how bad? Like I had a good friend who was protesting, who was boycotting Taco Bell because she understood some of their labor practices with people who pick tomatoes in California. I don't know where she got this information or how, and then I thought, am I gonna do that? Am I gonna dig that far into every company to find out like what those layers are? And I can say, just purely from a logistic perspective, that feels really overwhelming. But
From a logistic perspective, there's going to come a point where you starve.
well, you can't. I mean,
Because
right?
you can't live your life by boycotting everything that has a problem somewhere in its logistic chain.
And so, yeah, where does that line happen?
But if we're going to talk about the director being enough to cause a boycott,
Right.
then the Harvey Weinstein, the producer, but then you're talking the scope, the number of movies that a producer is working on at any one time, especially an executive producer, the head of a studio.
Right.
That means the entire studio, and now tens of thousands of jobs are at risk because of this one person.
Yeah, although some of it does have to do with what their response is to when things actually break. I mean, in an ideal world, they would have managed this soon. I mean, like, they do something about it immediately. But I think as long as that person still brings in some bucks, they're willing to kind of negotiate and be like, that's not bad. It's all alleged, right? You know, so if they're willing to sort of cut ties, and people cut ties with Kevin Spacey pretty fast,
Right.
and so it's a little admirable to say like, okay, he's no longer going forward. So there's something about like production going forward that I think absolves us in a way that maybe it shouldn't, but it can.
Yeah, and again with Kevin Spacey, they cut ties pretty fast once it became public.
Right.
We don't know.
No, we don't know.
We don't know how long people
Yes.
had heard things about
Yes,
Kevin Spacey.
yes.
So
And I mean, if that's what it takes.
Bill Cosby, allegations going back decades.
Yeah.
Until Burris, I think it's Hannibal Burris.
Yeah.
Hannibal Burris started doing stand-up routines about it. And at the time, he was a relative unknown comic, but he was known enough to know what was going on with Bill Cosby. So
There's a philosophical / ethical question that gets asked a lot in corporate activism, and it is like, do you support a company that does the right thing for the wrong reason?
Right.
So
Right.
if a company cuts ties with somebody, even if you don't believe that they would have cut ties with that person,
Right.
and understanding that your activism is a tiny, tiny drop in the bucket for these companies,
Sure.
right? Often, do you then say, well, you know, they cut ties with Kevin Spacey, so I'm going to go back because they did the right thing, even if I think they did it for the wrong reason. And I think the wrong reason they did it was they were clearly covering the bottom line. They may be doing it with somebody else currently that they totally know about, and they're just hoping that doesn't come to light.
Right.
one second. Finish. Sorry.
So really that was
Okay,
it.
all right.
Yeah,
So we had to do a quick pause to
Okay.
reset the camera. So
Okay.
so apologize for that, but it was about to cut you off
Okay.
anyway. So
And I would say that I will go back to them because I think this movement, like, I think intent is relevant in murder, but not like if they're able to be like, oh, let's read the room and realize this is not something that's cool with most people. If that's enough to drive them to make a change, I don't care, make the change. And that goes back to this idea though, that like, that's why I want to put my money where my mouth is. Like, I'm not gonna, if that's what's gonna affect them making changes, then I'm not gonna put money if I don't believe in it. So that's kind of like, that's the pressure I'm gonna apply. And I feel like if that's what makes them buckle, that's okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's one other aspect to this question that I wanted to kind of wanted to talk about, and it kind of goes to where I kind of draw the line, because for me the distinction between a director versus the key grip, it starts becoming too arbitrary, and I don't want to punish Sasha. I just had her name. Sasha Luce. And all the other actors, all the other actors who this might be their one chance. I don't want to see them harmed because of one person's bad actions. Where I will draw the line is where somebody is hiring, a company is hiring somebody, and that you know that this person has been convicted of something. So, for example, going back to the '90s movie Powder. Victor Silva had been already convicted of sexual abuse, molesting a child on set from a previous movie, and Disney still hired him years later to direct another movie. That is completely unacceptable. Shane Black hiring his friend, and I get that people go through the system, they've paid their debt to society, but especially in an artistic medium where trust is so important, you have to inform other people on the set what's going on.
Absolutely. That is so cut and dry,
Yeah.
because you could just easily say, I personally vouch for this guy. He gets it. He made a gigantic mistake. I'm going to bring it to you. You're the cast. I'd like to put him in this role, but you need to know up front what his history is, and you have a say in this. That to me would be such a different conversation than, oh, by the way, after the fact, this guy's a rapist.
Yeah. Absolutely. And then the other place where I kind of draw a distinction that we haven't hit on is if you look at, for example, the movie Anna and Luc Besson's filmography, you can see the themes of his domination throughout the movies. If you go back to Leon or The Professional, everybody looks at this as this almost romantic movie of this child who has a crush that she's willing to die for on this older man. And we kind of romanticize that, but in reality, it's the fantasy of an abusive male, being Luc Besson. So in these kind of instances, and we were talking about the various rape scenes and the fetishized violent women throughout Luc Besson's movies, whether it's La Femme Nikita or Lucy or Anna or The Professional. It's really, you can't distinguish the art from the artist, because the art is, in these cases, an aspect of the artist, and the art is as problematic as the artist's behavior.
Well, I don't know about that. Like, I think an art and their artist, the art is not the artist is not the art, but it can be.
But what I'm saying is, in these instances, they are. Whereas if you're talking about, say, Bohemian Rhapsody and Bryan Singer,
right.
Bohemian Rhapsody is in no way, shape, or form an apologetic for sexual abuse.
Right.
It is a movie about Freddie Mercury, and it's loosely a movie about Freddie Mercury and Queen. It has nothing to do with sexual abuse.
Right.
Whereas the movie Powder and then all of Luc Besson's movies, it is impossible to remove the aspect of domination and sexual abuse from those movies.
But I believe, yes, okay. So I think we can go back when we start looking at the correlation between a person's life and then the art, and building those and sort of seeing those connections. But as a consumer, I feel that my job is to go in and participate with art separate from the artist. and to engage with it without knowing their life, because as a writer we really believe, or at least I personally believe, the artist, like as a writer, my writing is not me. Like I can create characters and things and themes and setups and drama that's totally separate from my life. And so understanding that it can be fiction is really important, I think, to participating in art. So I think retroactively to look back and say there's this and this and this, and sort of being a cognizant citizen in the world and knowing that, oh, I don't want to see that film because we have an understanding of history. When I enter a film, when I go to a painting, when I go into a story, generally my thought is to think of them as separate until it proves problematic.
Can I throw another wrench into your system? So you have different kinds of directors, right? So John Ford, Stanley Kubrick, John Ford, like My Darling Clementine from the 1950s, auteurs, and by auteur they are, I mean, maybe nobody has ever been more of an auteur than Stanley Kubrick, a domineering, nothing wrong with him as far as we know. I like Stanley Kubrick. Right. Yeah, please. And somebody who oversees every aspect of production. And then I was trying, while you were talking, there was part of me that was trying to think, so who would be like at the opposite end of that spectrum? And I'm thinking of Spinal Tap, Best in Show, and I can't think of the guy's name.
Christopher Guest?
Yeah,
Christopher Guest.
Yeah.
So collaborative that the film ultimately, sure, it's Christopher Guest's vision, but is this ensemble vision that comes forward. So I accuse Stanley Kubrick of having more to say about what happens, and so it's harder for me to separate Stanley Kubrick from his art than it is for me to separate Christopher Guest.
Well, I don't think that throws a wrench in what I was saying. I think that kind of mirrors what I was saying. The Luc Besson's filmography is definitely reflective of his views. And it's in some ways it could in fact be just reimagining on film what his private fantasies are. Whereas again, going back to Bohemian Rhapsody, that has nothing to do with Bryan Singer's behavior, other than Bryan Singer is gay, so it was important for him to do a movie about a gay icon. That's the extent of the relationship between him personally. Just in talking about the distance of the art from the artist.
Sure, yes.
And one thing that we haven't talked about here, and maybe we won't, but I would say that the editor is like almost way more responsible often than the filmmaker for some of those things than the director. So sometimes the director is sort of putting it out there, but a lot of times the director, sometimes they have final cut, sometimes they don't, sometimes the studio has final cut. So then you're in a situation where, maybe a well-intentioned director, but under a different sort of studio head, is having, their film is being cut in a different sort of way. We can't assume that every single decision belongs to them. Correct. If you're making Transformers 3 and you're that dude, every decision is yours.
Well, actually,
Michael Bay.
Right.
Yes. Right.
Yeah.
Well, but I want to look back around to what you said, because you were talking about how that if someone is essentially convicted, if it's like sort of been proven or substantiated, maybe that's a better way to say it, in a court of law, then that's when it becomes problematic. So is that what you're saying? That so like if it's alleged at that point, is that
No, what I'm saying is if it's really, when it becomes clear that the art is an actual expression of the problematic behavior, where the art itself becomes problematic, then I'm more inclined to say I'm not gonna watch that. I'm gonna boycott that.
Okay.
Whereas I'm not gonna go out and not see Bohemian Rhapsody because of Bryan Singer, because the movie itself has nothing to do with that. But watching Anna, I see somebody fetishizing violence against women throughout his movies now.
Can you do that without hindsight? Do you not have to have seen the movie to
well,
know
that's an interesting question.
Know that you wouldn't go see it?
Going back, like we both were talking about how much we love the movie The Professional.
Right. I
need to go back and check my values, because that is a disgusting movie. It is an abhorrent movie, because yes, there are instances where young women fall for older men, or young boys fall for older women. It happens. But in this case, it's not a reflection of something that happening in real life. It's the reflection of a middle-aged man's fantasy of a young girl falling for a middle-aged man.
But if you didn't know, like, let's say he was clean. Let's say that nothing had ever happened. His record was good, was fine. Would that movie be okay?
The movie, The Professional, is still problematic for those themes because it is written and directed by a middle-aged man about a young girl having sexual fantasies about a middle-aged man.
I did not read. Now, granted, it's been a really long time since Professional. I never read it as sexual.
Oh my God! Yeah, you need to watch it again. It is clearly sexual. She is literally there's a whole montage of her putting on different outfits, trying to hit on Jean-Luc. I think that's the name.
Name of the character.
Yeah.
No, I read it as much more innocent than that.
Oh no.
Much more about a paternal daughter sort of idea, but it's been easily 20 years since. I mean, it's been a really long time since.
No,
I've seen it,
I have a feeling if you watched it now, particularly those scenes, you'd be you'd probably question what you ever saw it in to begin with.
But if we look at Anna, which is a more recent example, I didn't see anything in that was more dire than anything I've seen in any other film about women. There was nothing about it that clued me into a problematic director.
Right,
So,
and honestly, I didn't know either. Other than there were scenes where, as the scene was happening, I was like, man, do we have to see this again? Do we have to have a close up on a woman's face as she lies there expressionless as her ne'er-do-well boyfriend rails her from behind?
Right. Yeah.
What was the necessity of that?
It was just cheap storytelling.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in that instance, it was problematic for me regardless. It became even more problematic knowing that Luc Besson was actually probably guilty of raping somebody.
So then, do we have an obligation to know that before we go in to see something,
No.
or to decide?
No.
You know what I mean? That's I guess sort of the balance of it.
I'm not going to read the IMDb and figure out everybody that's in a movie ahead of time and try to figure it out. So, so no, you don't have I don't think anybody can reasonably say we have an obligation to know everything.
Not everything.
The question is when you do know something.
Once you know, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, can't go back.
And I think you brought up something that's really important and right on the money when you were talking about being a writer and, is that just lazy? Because there is stuff that you can do in a film that communicates something, but it's been done, maybe the first time it was done in a film, it was brilliant. And the second and the third time it was fine. But it becomes this sort of I'm going to totally de-emotionalize it. It becomes like swinging doors on a saloon.
Yeah.
Where it's just a thing. And we know when we see that door, when there's a shot of that door opening, it tells us that something is going to happen. But filmmakers who are really thinking about this are like, do I really need to do the swinging door thing?
Right.
If it's homage, sure. But maybe there's another way for me to tell this same story.
We're gonna table that for a whole separate conversation because we've actually got a whole line of movie trope discussions that are going to be coming up in the future.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
And we'll talk,
Yeah.
but I'm actually pointing that at, tropes are tropes for a reason, including tropes of violence and tropes of, I'm not saying it's a good reason, but tropes of violence and tropes of, the young ingenue who likes the older man, all of these things. And they come up again and again and again. And I think they come up because, let's be real, they exist in the fantasy life of people who go to see movies. So it's not just the people who are making them.
No.
But we're doing this feedback loop where we're supporting that kind of behavior and sometimes that kind of thinking for people. So it goes even beyond just is it okay to put that in? I'm it's probably okay, but is it ultimately the right thing to do? And really, could you have come up with something better?
It's lazy filmmaking. It's lazy storytelling.
We like the movie Mother. Lots of people didn't like the movie Mother. We won't get, but I will say, not lazy filmmaking.
No, true.
I mean, it was
I will give
everything,
it that.
everywhere you thought it was going to go, it did not go. It kept taking left turns.
She might disagree with that, but that is a conversation for that is a different conversation.
I know, that's why I brought that up in particular.
Yeah.
But give some credit due for somebody who said we're going to try to do something different,
correct,
like it or not.
Yes,
so,
which he didn't do, right? Like, so then and I think maybe that's what's difficult is when we see someone whose work is brilliant, and then we have to confront bad behaviors, right? Because like that, this guy's easy to give up. I'm like, this wasn't worth it. I didn't like, I wasn't like, there was no grief in being like, I'm done with that guy. He was boring. It was a boring film. But what happens when someone is doing something so innovative that their innovation creates a true conflict in consuming art? And I'm just trying to think, just as I was talking, if there's an example, and I don't have anything yet.
I love the painter Willem De Kooning. Like, I am just like, I came around a corner one time and saw a piece of his art hanging next to a Pollock in the Museum of Modern Art in Kansas City and started crying. Aww. Because like his stuff is so meaningful. He did not treat the women in his life really well. Like, I don't think he was a rapist. I don't think he was, but he wasn't necessarily a great guy. And it's like, and his paintings are of women. I mean, they're very sort of abstract, but they're of women. And so I am a rabid consumer of his paintings, and I still know that he's a problematic guy. So
1 second. Okay, so I said I put a pin in something, and I think it's time to go back to it, and that was viewing certain things for the educational value, and I wasn't planning on talking about this. I put no thought into this ahead of time, so I'm kind of out on a limb on this, but I want to challenge the idea that watching something like Annie Hall is still relevant in terms of film history, and particularly movies like Birth of a Nation, Gone with the Wind. Are these movies absolutely important to the history of film? Absolutely.
Crazily important, all three of them. Unfortunately, actually, as important as they are, because there's some loathsome content to Birth of a Nation in particular, but Gone with the Wind, it's like right there on the surface. Not loathsome content so much in Annie Hall, but definitely, problematic filmmaker.
So, and I was trying to look up, I'm blanking on the name of it. There's a German war film.
All Quiet on the Western Front.
No, World War II, a Nazi propaganda film.
Oh, the Leni Riefenstahl films. Triumph of the Will.
Triumph of the Will. Yeah. So that was the other one I was trying to look up. I think these movies in general get too much credit for how groundbreaking they are. Triumph of the Will. There was nothing in that movie that wasn't done in other movies.
That could be argued.
Yeah. Almost all the shots, nothing had been done on that scale and with that much of a budget. But I think a lot of the reason why something like Triumph of the Will, and there's a really good there's a really good video on YouTube that talks about this. I don't have it on the top of my head what it was. The reason that Triumph of the Will is taught in film school has less to do with the value of it to film history, and it has more to do with the politics of World War II, Germany, and U.S. relations.
I saw it in a documentary and propaganda class, a documentary and propaganda film class in college.
Right.
And that's actually where it was considered very important. It was considered important as a propaganda film.
Yeah.
There was a concerted movement, particularly immediately after World War II, on the Western part, to kind of be an apologetic for normal everyday Germans. And something like Triumph of the Will was elevated, even though almost everything in it had been done in other places. It was kind of elevated as part of that movement to kind of excuse the German populace. And then going back to something like Gone with the Wind, again, in terms of budget, in terms of scale, yeah, absolutely, probably the biggest. I think it was the biggest movie at the time. But everything that's in that film could be accessed in another means without pushing this movie to the forefront.
Can I just give you one quick example?
Yeah,
sure. And it's the most modern of the things that we're talking about. If you don't have Annie Hall, you don't get The Office. And the reason if you don't have Annie Hall, you don't get The Office, is in Annie Hall, people are walking down the street. They stop and they turn and they look at the camera and they start talking to the camera. No big deal, right? But it was a big deal because people weren't really doing that before, and it was considered sort of breaking
the fourth wall.
It was breaking the wall, exactly. And so now when Jim sits in the office and talks to the camera, I mean there's a lineage to that, and knowing where that kind of thing came from. I think if you're going to do art history, you're going to do critique, you're going to do that sort of thing, you want to know where these things came from. And so I think it's important to know that that wasn't being done before in Annie Hall, really on any kind of, in any sort of big way.
Sure. But you just described it to me, and because I've seen everything that came after, I don't need to. So then do I need to go see Annie Hall because I've never seen it? I don't need to, right?
Maybe we should consider it. We don't necessarily have to see it.
Correct, yes.
So I would push back on a couple ones. One, it's kind of a logical fallacy to say that because A came before B, B could not have happened.
I'll give you that.
There's a thing called it happens a lot in evolutionary thinking where we look back and we see that chimpanzees or the antecedent to chimpanzees and humans automatically would have led to humans, and that's just not. It could have gone a bunch of different directions.
Right, correct.
And also, there's
Hindsight
a thing
bias.
called convergent evolution.
Yeah.
Fourth wall breaking did not start with Annie Hall. So
true, but let's take it here. If you didn't have the first Star Wars movie, would you have had the rest of the Star Wars movies?
No.
So it's the same thing. I mean, we're just taking a piece of the way something was done and saying that clearly affected the way that people think. I'm not saying that you I'm not saying you don't get The Office.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that there's this little piece of thinking which changed in that moment the way people thought about what they could do with films. And that has and you're absolutely right, people have been breaking the wall for a long time.
Yeah.
But it found its way into The Office.
Well, and I think what's difficult about film and maybe television as well is it's also a medium that is still, because of the production, how much production effort it takes, there aren't a lot of counterexamples of other histories. So that's also the history of white male filmmakers, right?
Sure.
Because if we look at books,
that was one of the things I was trying to access when I was talking about Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind.
Yeah, is that if we look at narrative, and I think it's a little bit probably easier to see within art and books, is that that's what we sometimes talk about when we're saying but this man's genius, we can't let this go. Traditionally, this men's genius, we can't let it go because it's so influential in the history of white male canon, right? But then there's all these other histories that aren't being accessed or looked at, except by historians who are sort of looking at those other elements. But what's hard about film is it's not like there's a bunch of women who were secretly making films somewhere that we can go and look up and be but they were doing it before that, because it's not quite the same. So that's where film's kind of different.
And each of the examples I brought up in not in some way in a large measure dealt with were from a perspective of white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
And they're elevated because, and I would argue that they're elevated because they're white supremacist and not because of their actual film artistic technical merit. I think there's a lot of politicking that elevated those movies. And they also came at the exclusion of all those other stories that could have been told if all the air wasn't being sucked out by these movies.
Right.
So.
But I think what's kind of cool is traditionally a lot of female-centric female-centric art has been relegated to craft work. But now they're sort of recognizing that quilt making is this whole artistic thing and stuff like that. I think what's kind of cool about where we're living now is that the birth of YouTube and places like Netflix is all those other additional narratives are finding place to grow. And are they the ones being released in those big box offices? No, those are still being dominated predominantly by white men, but there is now ground for these other narratives to be popping up, and I think a lot of film historians are going to have to go back and look at Netflix. They're going to have to look at those places where smaller indie films are coming up and people are able to connect with them directly. YouTube as well. I mean, all those platforms now exist in a way that's kind of exciting.
It's like the way that in world history, the Mongols are a footnote and
Yeah.
it's all about what's happening in Europe.
Yeah.
You know, and,
Yes,
and
right.
and the reality is that, like, yes, there are other people working in other ways to do this kind of stuff, and film is tough
Yeah.
because, you know, Grandma Moses could pick up a paintbrush
Right.
and paint some stuff and have it be this sort of like oddly brilliant, weird, like, why is that so good? It
Yeah.
really shouldn't. But you couldn't. A woman couldn't pick up a film camera because even most white men, you actually had to be a white dude with some money
Yeah.
Right.
to even start to
Yeah.
think about making a documentary.
I mean, even-
much
yeah,
less making
yeah.
a feature film.
Oh,
so.
yeah, exactly. That's part of it too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we're getting ready to kind of wrap this up. It's been an interesting discussion. And for those of you that are able to watch this, you know, we're interested in hearing what you have to say. So go ahead and leave your comments below. Try to keep them. Well, I'm not even going to say try to keep them polite because most of you will and a couple of you won't. So we'll just see what happens. But it's a very. I think the one thing we can walk away with is it's a very personal question. There is not going to be any hard and fast rule of what a person should do.
Right.
It's you know, whatever you're comfortable with. The one thing I would say is be cognizant of where your money goes and how it affects what gets made. That's probably, I think you said that, and that's probably the most important thing is when you know that somebody is a sexual predator or an avowed racist or just in some way a deplorable human being, stop supporting that.
Right.
And it really, especially if we're talking about a painting, it's a little bit easier because the number of people that impacts is so small. But when you're talking about a major motion picture or a TV series, you're talking about, you know, with Roseanne, that was dozens of people that had the possibility of losing their job
Right, sure.
over something stupid that one person said.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
and those are the reasons why there is no real hard and fast rule. So with that being said, any closing thoughts on the original question of separating art from the artist? Any closing thoughts?
I feel like I'm all in.
Okay.
That's right. Me too.
All right. So thanks for watching. For the last time, I'm Jeff.
Scott?
Renee.
Get on the bandwagon.